How does a man go from lying in intensive care, begging for air, to being treated like free labor for his son-in-law's party? How does a daughter look at a hospital bed and still say that if her father does not show up to decorate, he should not dare come home? This is how I lay there, listened to her words, pressed block on my phone, and quietly decided that my return home would not be the same as before. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Alan Reed, and when this story began, I woke up to a soft beeping sound and a plastic taste in my mouth. For a few seconds, I could not tell if it was day or night. The ceiling above me was pale and too bright, and there was a weight on my chest that was not physical, more like a heavy thought that would not move. I tried to lift my hand and felt wires, tubes, tape on my skin. My throat was dry. When I moved, an alarm on one of the machines ticked a little faster, and a nurse's face appeared in my field of vision. She leaned over me and said calmly that I was in intensive care, that I was safe, and that I should not try to sit up. Her name tag read Kelly. She told me I had a serious heart problem the day before, that I had been very lucky, and that the doctors were watching me closely. She asked if I understood. I nodded a little, because speaking was work. Then a man in a white coat came in. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and checked the monitors. He spoke slowly, as if I were a student in one of those safety videos. He said my heart had gone through a big shock, that some arteries were blocked, and that they had done a procedure. He explained that the next days were important. I must rest, avoid stress, avoid strong emotions, and let my body heal. He said they would keep me in intensive care for at least a few days. I listened and thought of one person, my daughter, Sophie. I pictured her as a little girl with tangled hair, running into my arms after school. For a moment, that memory was so clear that I almost forgot where I was. Then the beeping pulled me back. I reached out a little and touched the side of the bed, trying to signal that I wanted my phone. Nurse Kelly understood. She asked if I wanted to call someone. I tried to say that I at least wanted to send a message. She put the phone gently in my hand and helped guide my thumb to unlock it. I saw the list of names, but my eyes went direct to Sophie's number. I thought she must be worried. She did not know I was lying here with machines helping my heart. I wanted to write a short text, something like a simple note that I was in the hospital, that I needed rest, that the doctors were doing their best. I did not want to scare her. Before I even opened the messaging screen, the phone vibrated in my hand. Her name was on the display. Nurse Kelly saw it and smiled, as if this was a good sign. I answered and tried to say her name, but my voice came out thin and rough. Sophie sounded excited. She spoke fast, so fast that at first I thought she already knew I was in the hospital and was nervous. But as I listened, I realized she was talking about something else. She talked about the next day, about how it was Ryan's big birthday, and how they had planned a large dinner. She said there was so much to do, food to cook, decorations to hang, tables to move. She complained that nobody was helping and that she was tired. In my bed, I tried to tell her that I was in intensive care, that I had had a serious heart problem. I said the doctor did not want me to move or get upset, that it hurt even to sit up. I thought she would go quiet with worry. For a second, there was silence, and I felt hope. Instead, she sighed into the phone and said that I always had a way of making things more dramatic than they were. She said that I had been feeling tired for years, and that this was not new. She reminded me that I had promised to help with the preparations, that Ryan's colleagues were coming, that the house had to look perfect, and that I always said family events were important. I tried again to explain. I said that I had wires in my arms, that my heart had just been fixed, that the doctor was right in the room. I heard the monitors in the background. Even I could hear the change in their rhythm. Nurse Kelly stepped closer. Dr. Patel had come back in and was watching me closely. Sophie grew more sharp. She said I could not do this to them. She said they had told everyone that I would be there early to help, that people expected food, that Ryan deserved a great birthday. She said I needed to think less about myself and think more about what kind of father I wanted to be seen as. The words felt strange because I was lying there in a hospital bed, thin blanket over my legs, connected to machines. I wanted to say this out loud, to ask her how she could say those things now. But I could hardly breathe, and Dr. Patel was lifting his hand, signaling me to calm down. I whispered that I could not come. I said I was not feeling well, that I could not leave the hospital, that I needed rest. I expected her to cry, or at least sound worried at last. Instead, she raised her voice. She said that if I did not come to help, if I did not show up for Ryan's birthday like I had promised, then I should not dare come back to the house at all. She said I would not be welcome again if I let them down in front of guests. She did not know it, but she was saying this on speaker. Nurse Kelly had pressed a button so Dr. Patel could hear both sides, since he was checking my response to stress. Both of them heard my daughter say that to a man lying in intensive care, and both of them stared at me as if they were not sure they had heard right. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady beeping and the little hiss of air. I felt my chest tighten, not from the medical problem, but from something inside that had nothing to do with arteries. I thought of the days when I had walked miles to pick Sophie up from school in the rain. I thought of the nights I had spent half asleep in a chair while she had a fever. I thought of how I had worked double shifts to pay for her college. Now she was telling me that if I did not leave intensive care to hang streamers and cook food, I should not come home again. It was strange that she used that word. The house she talked about as hers was still, in fact, mine. I felt the phone heavy in my hand. For years, I had made excuses for her tone. I had told myself that stress made her sharp, that she did not mean it, that it was my job as a father to understand and forgive. I had repeated that line so often that it had become like one of the warning messages you stop hearing because it plays every day. This time, something changed. Maybe it was the machine beside me, showing my heart rate climbing. Maybe it was the look on Dr. Patel's face, a mix of worry and quiet anger. Maybe it was Nurse Kelly, eyes wide, hand over her mouth as she listened. For the first time, I saw Sophie's words not as a moment of stress, but as a clear sign of how she saw me now. I told her once more that I could not come. I said that I was not well, that I needed to stay in the hospital. I said it in a calm voice, almost like I was giving instructions to a coworker in my old plant days. She answered that I was choosing to embarrass her and that I would not step into the house again if I did this. Then the line went quiet. She did not ask if I was scared. She did not ask if I needed anything. I ended the call. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second. Then, very slowly, I pressed the option to block her number. It was a small move, but in that moment, it felt larger than any form I had ever signed. The phone screen went dark in my hand. Dr. Patel put his hand lightly on my shoulder. He said he was sorry he had heard that. He told me that nobody should speak that way to a patient in my condition. He reminded me that my heart could not carry this kind of weight, that I needed rest and calm, not demands and threats. His voice was steady, but his eyes showed real concern. Nurse Kelly stayed near the bed. She checked the monitors again and adjusted the drip. She told me that she had heard every word and that if I ever needed someone to confirm what had been said, she would remember. She said she could not understand how a child could put a party before a parent's health. Her voice was quiet, almost like she was speaking to herself. I did not answer right away. I just lay there, feeling the cold bars of the bed rail under my fingers. I realized that I was more tired of being used than I was of being sick. In that small, white room, with its constant beeping and smell of disinfectant, something inside me settled. It was not rage. It was not a loud decision. It was more like the click of a switch being turned to a different position. I looked at the phone resting on the tray table now, screen dark, my daughter's number blocked. For the first time in many years, I did not feel the urge to call back and explain myself. I did not reach for it again. I let it stay there while the monitors slowly returned to a calmer rhythm and the room grew quiet. The only sound left was the gentle beep of the heart monitor, steady and patient as if it was counting down to something I could not yet see. When they moved me out of intensive care some days later, the room they took me to was quieter. Fewer machines, no constant alarms, just the slow roll of carts in the hall and the sound of other patients breathing. I could sit up a little by then. My chest still felt tender and my legs were weak, but my head was clear in a way it had not been for a long time. Lying there with nothing to do, I started to travel backward in my mind. I thought about how I had reached this point, not only with my heart, but also with Sophie. The call in intensive care felt like a final sharp cut, but I knew it had not come from nowhere. It was the end of a long line of small pushes, and I had let each one slide past me, telling myself it was easier that way. I remembered a different kind of noise years earlier when I worked at the plant. The factory floor had its own music, metal against metal, the low hum of big machines, the buzz of voices as people shouted over the sound. Back then, my body had moved easily between the lines of equipment. I had climbed stairs, crawled under belts, and fixed things with my hands and my mind. People would look for me when something went wrong. They would wait for me to speak before they opened a machine or reset a control. There was a small break room with plastic chairs and a cracked table where we ate packed lunches. I used to sit there with Mark and a few others. They often asked me to explain how some old system worked because I had been there when it was first installed. Management respected that. At one point, a younger supervisor, also named Mark, told me that some of the improvements I had suggested saved the company a lot of money each year. He did not say it as a favor, he said it like a fact. It was around that time that my wife's health began to fail. The house felt different, darker, and Sophie, who was still in school, watched me with big eyes as I tried to juggle shifts and hospital visits. I was the one who sat at her bedside when she slept. I was the one who made simple meals and helped with homework. When Sophie got sick, I stayed up all night with her and still went to work in the morning. Back then, Sophie would run to the door when I came home, happy to tell me anything that had happened that day. When my wife passed after a long illness, it was just the two of us in the house. I was both mother and father, cook and mechanic. I did not complain. I told myself that this was my duty and also my gift, to raise my daughter well. I worked extra hours, took on difficult shifts, and slowly built up savings so she would not have to start life with nothing. I paid for a small but solid college for her. I still remember how proud I was in that simple restaurant after her graduation when we sat with paper menus and cheap decorations. Sophie had laughed and said the place was not fancy, but she had squeezed my hand and told me that she knew how hard I had worked. In that moment, I believed her words would always be true. She met Ryan not long after. He was smooth and confident, always ready with a story about his plans. He liked to talk about the people he knew in his company, about future promotions, about bigger cars and bigger houses. At first, I tried to see him the way Sophie did, as a man with big dreams. He would clap me on the shoulder and tell me that he respected how I had raised her. He said that he hoped to be a provider too one day. The wedding was much larger than I could easily afford, but Sophie's eyes shone when she showed me the venue. I told myself that it was all right, that a father only marries off a daughter once. I took money from savings, shifted some investments, and paid what the planners asked. I still have the image in my mind. Sophie in her dress, smiling at Ryan while photographers rushed around them. In the corner of one picture, I see myself holding a tray of drinks because someone had called out that they were short on hands. It was also around that time that we set up the trust. My friend Lewis, the lawyer, had suggested a family arrangement when I said I wanted Sophie to have security. The trust would hold the old family house and some investments, with conditions to protect everyone in case of divorce or serious disrespect. I remembered thinking that such clauses were not needed, that my daughter would never turn her back on me. I signed anyway, more to please Lewis than because I thought we would use it. The deal we made seemed good then. Sophie and Ryan would live in the house. I would move to a small apartment nearby to give them space. They would pay only small costs, and I would cover big repairs while they got started in life. It sounded like a kind act, and I was glad I could offer it. Time did something slow and strange after that. At first, they would invite me over for dinner once a week. Sophie would call and ask if I could fix a shelf or take a look at a leaking pipe. I did it with a smile, feeling useful. Ryan would talk about work and how he was climbing up the ladder. But little by little, something shifted. They stopped asking if a time worked for me. They simply informed me that there was a problem and expected me to show up. The language in the house changed, too. The place I had lived in for years became theirs in every sentence. When guests came, Sophie and Ryan would walk them through the rooms, talking about what they wanted to redecorate, never once mentioning who had paid for the walls in the first place. When I was there, they would introduce me as someone who helped out a lot, like a neighbor who was handy, not as the man who owned the deed and had raised the bride. I remember one evening when they had some of Ryan's co-workers over. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing dishes because the sink was full. Ryan leaned in the doorway, laughing with his friends, and made a joke about how I was too fragile for real work now, but still useful as a house helper. He said it as if it was a charming line. The group laughed politely. Sophie smiled and rolled her eyes, as if to say it was a familiar story. Nobody looked at my face. I told myself it was only humor. Sophie had always liked teasing. I reminded myself that Ryan was under a lot of pressure at work, that young men sometimes tried too hard to impress others. It was easier to make excuses than to accept that something deeper was wrong. The pattern grew, not with big events, but with hundreds of small ones. If they wanted to go out for a weekend away, they would call and say that someone had to watch the dog and look after deliveries. They would tell me the dates, not ask if I was free. If an appliance broke, they would send a list of items to buy and a time to come fix it. Often, I would arrive to an empty house, a key under the mat, and a note about what needed to be done. Money flowed in one direction only. When Ryan lost a position for a while, I moved funds from a small investment account to help them keep up with their lifestyle. They framed it as a loan, then as something they would balance later, then as a normal part of what parents did. The numbers on my statements dropped. Their home grew more comfortable, more decorated, more full of things. When they had events at the house, I usually stood in the background. Sophie would plan large dinners and invite friends, co-workers, even distant cousins. She would call and tell me there was much to prepare. I would arrive early, cook, set up tables, carry heavy trays, then slip away when the guests started to dance or gather around the main couple. If someone thanked me, it was with surprise, as if they did not know the effort came from my hands. Over the years, the way she spoke to me also changed. When she wanted something, there was less warmth, more pressure. She would tell me that I was all she had, that I had always been the strong one, that she needed my help to make a good life for her and Ryan. Under those words was a different message, that my own needs came second, that my role was to support without limits. It is only when I lay in the hospital bed after the intensive care that I began to see the line between support and use. I realized how often I had agreed to things I did not want, just to keep peace. I had told myself that it was normal, that this was what fathers did. But thinking back, I saw how few times she had asked what I needed in return. A recent memory moved forward in my mind, sharp and clear like a knife on a table. It was an evening not long before my heart failed. I had gone over to the house because Sophie said we needed to discuss some papers. The kitchen smelled of rich food. Ryan sat at the table, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. A folder lay between us, thick with documents. He explained in a smooth, practiced tone that it was time to simplify things. He said it would be better if they had full control of the house, properly in their names, so they could make decisions without having to ask me about every detail. He said that I could stay safe in my apartment and enjoy my retirement, that this was just a formality for the future. He pushed the folder toward me with the tip of his finger, as if it were something harmless. Sophie stood by the counter, arms crossed, waiting. She said that this would make everyone's life easier, that it was about trust, that I should show I believed in them. There was an edge of impatience in her voice, like she was tired of explaining. I glanced through the first pages and saw terms I did not fully like, words that suggested permanent transfer, rights given up, control handed over. I felt a small knot form in my stomach, but I also felt her eyes on me, full of expectation. In the end, I closed the folder slowly and told them I would think about it, that I never signed anything important without letting my lawyer read it first. Their faces fell for a second, then tightened. When I left that night, I did not take the folder with me. I asked to keep it later, and when I finally did, I put it in my locked drawer at home, under old plant records and family papers. I told myself I would look at it with Lewis one day. As I lay in the hospital now, the soft light on the ceiling above me, that folder rose in my mind like a clear, bright picture. I could almost feel its weight in my hands, the texture of the cardboard, the sound of the clip inside. Behind it stood years of small jokes, small orders, small demands. The last thought I had before I drifted off to sleep that afternoon was simple and hard. That unsigned folder was still in my drawer at the apartment, waiting for me. The afternoon light in the new ward was softer than in intensive care. It came in through narrow windows and made faint lines on the floor. The machines around me were smaller, and most of the time they stayed quiet. I could sit up with the bed raised. I could walk a few steps with help. On the outside, it looked like I was getting better. Inside, something else was changing in a different way. Dr. Patel came by each morning with his tablet and calm voice. He told me my numbers were improving, but that my heart was still weak and needed real rest. He repeated that stress was not just a feeling for me now, it was a direct threat to my health. He asked gently about my situation at home. I gave short answers, saying that I had a daughter, that she was busy, that things were complicated. He listened without pushing, but I could tell he knew more from that call in intensive care than I wanted to say. One afternoon, he pulled the chair closer to my bed and spoke in a careful way. He said that sometimes the body breaks down after years of strain, and that sometimes the strain comes not only from work, but also from the way people are treated by those closest to them. He told me that in his experience, patients like me often went back to the same patterns that hurt them, and that then he would see them again in the same ward, only worse. He asked me to think very hard about my life, my stress, and what I allowed around me when I left the hospital. His words stayed with me long after he left. For years, I had thought my health problems were just age, the normal wear from factory work. I had not wanted to connect them to the constant calls, the demands, the little shocks of disrespect that I swallowed day after day. It had been easier to focus on the physical, on clogged arteries and tired muscles, than on the way my own child spoke to me. Later that day, Nurse Kelly came in to check my blood pressure. She was usually quick and cheerful, but this time she moved slower and seemed hesitant. After she wrote down the numbers, she looked at me and said she had been thinking a lot about that call from Sophie. She told me she had never heard anything like it, not in all her time working with patients who were seriously ill. She said that what my daughter had done was not just sharp words, it was a kind of line being crossed. She thought I needed to know that she and Dr. Patel had both heard it, that they would remember it, and that if there was ever any question about what had happened, they could confirm it. She did not use big legal terms, but I understood what she meant. She was telling me that I was not crazy, that my feelings were not a misunderstanding, and that I had witnesses. Hearing that from someone outside the family felt strange. For years, every time I had felt hurt by something Sophie said, I had told myself that I was sensitive, tired, maybe overreacting. When a nurse in a hospital, who had no reason to take sides, told me that what she heard was wrong, something in me settled into a new position. It felt like the ground under my feet slowly becoming solid again. The hospital days passed in a slow, repeating rhythm. Meals on trays, short walks down the corridor, checks of vital signs. But inside my head, nothing was repeating. I was replaying scenes from the last few years with a new kind of attention. When Ryan joked about me being fragile in front of his friends, I now saw not only the joke, but also the small, quick look he gave them, as if asking for their approval while he pushed me down. When Sophie told me she needed me to sign papers to show that I trusted them, I heard clearly now that trust in that sentence really meant control. One afternoon, the physiotherapist asked if I could manage a slow walk to the end of the corridor and back. They put a light robe over my shoulders and helped me stand. My legs shook at first, but after a few steps they remembered their job. As I moved past other rooms, I saw families sitting by beds, holding hands, whispering gentle words. Some had flowers, cards, little balloons with short messages. I realized that nobody was there for me. No one from my family had come to visit in those days. It was not that they did not know where I was. I had told Sophie I was in intensive care. I had spent my life being available every time she needed a ride, a signed form, a last-minute favor. Yet, when I lay in a bed that might have been my last, she had thought first of a party and then of punishment. The absence of her footsteps in that corridor said more than any speech. The next day, when I was allowed to go down to the small waiting room with supervision, I sat in one of the chairs by the window and watched the parking lot below. Cars came and went. Visitors carried bags and flowers. I thought about the house I owned but did not live in. I thought about the trust that I had created mainly to protect Sophie and give her comfort. I thought about the unsigned folder in my drawer at the apartment and how close I had come to giving everything away. Up until then, I had seen myself as someone at the mercy of others. I had believed that because I was older, because my body was weaker, because my heart had failed, I had to accept whatever treatment my daughter chose to give me. Sitting there by the window, I realized that this was not the full picture. I did not have physical strength like before, but I had something else. Years of work behind me, legal structures, ownership papers, and most of all, the ability to decide what I would and would not do from now on. When Nurse Kelly came to escort me back to the room, she mentioned quietly that they had updated my file with a note about my stress level and about the call from Sophie, in case any follow-up was needed. She said she was not a lawyer, but she knew that dates, times, and records could matter. She asked if I had someone I trusted outside the family to speak with about my affairs. I told her I had an old friend who was a lawyer, a man named Lewis. She nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that. The following morning, Dr. Patel came with my discharge plan. He said that if my numbers stayed stable, I could go home in a few days. He warned me that going back to the same environment could send me right back to the hospital. He advised me to think about where I would stay, who would be around me, and what kind of contact I would allow. He said that sometimes the strongest medicine was distance from what was hurting a person. After he left, I stared at the blank wall across from the bed. I imagined two different scenes. In one, I went back to my small apartment and waited for Sophie to notice I was gone from her life. In the other, I went back to the house and acted as if nothing had happened, cooking and fixing things while she spoke to me like a servant. Neither the silent distance nor the false peace felt right to me anymore. For the first time, I thought seriously about a third path, going back to my life, but on my own terms. Not with raised voice or wild moves, but with clear, firm steps inside the rules that already existed. I thought about the trust papers that Lewis had drawn up years ago. I remembered a quiet line he had pointed to with his pen, one about conditions of respect and contact. At the time, I had laughed and told him that such things were unnecessary. In that hospital bed, I saw that he had been more realistic than I was. I asked the nurse if I could go to the small cafe near the hospital entrance once I was cleared for longer walks. She checked with Dr. Patel, and later that day, she told me it would be fine if I went with a staff escort and stayed seated most of the time. When we reached the cafe, the smell of coffee and baked bread hit me, bringing back simpler days when Sophie and I would share a pastry on weekends. Nurse Kelly went to order a tea for me. When she came back, she sat across the small table for a moment, off duty for a short break. She told me again that she would stand by what she heard in intensive care. She said that in her job, she saw many families at their best and at their worst, and that what happened in my room was one of those clear moments that showed who a person really was. She suggested gently that I think about protecting myself, not in a harsh way, but in a firm, steady way. Her words were not emotional. They were practical, almost like instructions. They matched something that had already started forming in my mind. It felt like two separate lines finally meeting. my private decision and outside confirmation that I was not imagining things. After we went back to the ward, I lay on the bed and looked at the phone on my bedside table. For days, I had not touched it except to check the time. Sophie's number was still blocked. There were no missed calls from her, no messages asking how I was. There were some notifications from my bank, a notice from the electricity company, and nothing else that felt personal. Slowly, I went to my contact list and scrolled through names I had not called in a long time. Old coworkers, distant cousins, service numbers. Then I reached the name I had been thinking of since the day in the waiting room, Lewis Grant. Next to his name was the word lawyer, a small label I had added years ago when I first stored his number. I let my thumb rest on the screen, not yet pressing the call button. The room was quiet, the monitors steady, the corridor sounds far away. In that stillness, I understood that once I called Lewis, I would be choosing that third path and leaving the old pattern behind. I would not be the man who always said yes anymore. I would be the man who used what he had built to finally set terms. I lay there with the phone in my hand, the contact open, my thumb hovering just above the call button, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, that the next move would truly be mine. When they finally sent me home, the sky outside the hospital was a pale gray. I held the small bag with my clothes and medicine, and the nurse helped me into a taxi. My legs were shaky, but I could walk on my own. The driver asked where to, and for a brief second, my mouth almost gave Sophie and Ryan's address out of habit. I stopped myself and gave him the address of my small apartment instead. The ride was quiet. The city moved past the window, familiar and far away at the same time. I watched people hurry on the sidewalks, carrying shopping bags and talking on phones. None of them knew that a man in the back seat of that taxi had just decided he would not go home to the house his daughter claimed as her own. I sat there with my discharge papers on my lap and felt something like a line being drawn. The apartment smelled a little stale when I opened the door. I had been gone for some time, and the place had a stillness that was almost heavy. I put down my bag and sat on the edge of the bed to catch my breath. The room was simple: a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and an old wardrobe. On top of the wardrobe was the metal lockbox where I kept my important papers. I stood up slowly and went to it. The key was in the same cup on the table, where I always left it. I opened the box and saw the stack of envelopes and folders. Bank letters, old plant records, a few pictures, and, near the bottom, the folder Ryan had once slid across my daughter's kitchen table. Even before I took it out, I knew by touch which one it was. The cardboard was smoother, newer than the others. I set the folder on the table and did not open it yet. Instead, I picked up my phone. Lewis's name was still on the screen from the last time I had looked at it in the hospital. I sat down in the chair, took a slow breath, and finally pressed the call button. He answered with the same steady voice I remembered from years ago. He asked how I was. I told him that I had just come out of the hospital after a serious heart problem. I said that I needed to review some family arrangements we had made long ago because my situation with my daughter had changed. I did not go into detail. Even over the phone, the words from Sophie still hurt my chest when I thought of them. Lewis listened without interrupting. Then he said that I should come to his office as soon as I felt strong enough. He reminded me that we had drawn up certain documents carefully, with conditions meant to protect me, and that nothing important could be changed without my clear consent. There was something calm and practical in his tone that gave me a kind of courage. We set a time for the next day. That night I slept badly, not because of pain, but because old memories kept pushing against my closed eyes. I saw my wife in her hospital bed, Sophie as a child, the plant floor, the house I had handed to my daughter in trust. I saw Ryan's hand pushing the folder toward me. I saw Sophie's name on my phone in intensive care. Again and again, I heard her say that I should not dare come back if I did not help with the party. In the morning, I dressed slowly and took a taxi to Lewis's office. The building was a low, neat block of brick with a small sign by the door. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. His assistant led me to a meeting room with a long table and a window that looked out at a parking lot. I sat down and placed my folder on the table, feeling its weight as if it were full of more than documents. Lewis came in, shook my hand gently, and sat across from me. He asked first about my health. I told him about the intensive care, about Dr. Patel's warnings, and after some hesitation, about the phone call Sophie had made that day. I did not try to make it sound softer than it was. I repeated her words about the party, the help, and the house. I told him that the nurse and doctor had heard it all. He listened with a serious expression. He did not say that I was overreacting. He did not tell me to give her time. Instead, he said that this kind of clear statement from her changed things. He reminded me that when we had drafted the family trust and the papers about the house, we had included conditions about care and contact. He said that we had written those lines for rare cases, not expecting we would use them, but that they were real and valid. Then we turned to the paper itself. He opened his own file cabinet and pulled out his copies of the trust, the will, and the house documents. I put Ryan's folder next to them. Together, we went through the pages. He pointed out where the house was still in my name, where Sophie and Ryan did not own it, but only had the right to live there under certain conditions. He showed me the parts that said I could end that right if there was serious disrespect or if my health was harmed by the situation. He also looked through the papers Ryan had wanted me to sign. His mouth pressed into a thin line as he read. He said that if I had signed them, I would have given up control of the property and much of the trust. My role would have been reduced to something close to nothing. He said that it was good that I had listened to my instincts that day in their kitchen. We did not change anything that morning. Instead, Lewis suggested that I take a few steps to collect my medical records related to the intensive care stay, to get copies of my phone log around the day of Sophie's call, and to gather statements from the hospital staff who had heard it. He said that facts and dates would matter if the situation escalated. He also suggested that I review my bank records to see how much I had put into Sophie and Ryan's life over the years. I left his office with a list written in his neat handwriting. It did not feel like a revenge plan. It felt like a repair list, like the work orders we used to make at the plant when a system needed a full check, not just a quick fix. I understood that before I made any big moves, I had to know exactly how the system of my own life was built. My next stop was the bank. The branch manager was younger than me by many years, but he treated me with respect. I explained that I needed printed copies of my statements for the last several years and a summary of transfers from my accounts to the account Sophie and Ryan shared. I did not give details. I simply said it was for a personal review after a health incident. He nodded and set the printer to work. The pages came out in a long stream. When I later spread them on my kitchen table at home, the lines of numbers told a story that words had tried to hide. Month after month, there were transfers with notes like help with repairs, short-term support, wedding balance, bridge until bonus. Together, they formed a quiet pattern, my resources flowing toward them, almost never in the other direction. From the bank, I went to the hospital records office. There, with the help of a clerk, I requested copies of my admission notes, the intensive care reports, and the basic summary of my stay. The clerk asked if this was for insurance. I said it was partly for that and partly for my own records. I remembered what Nurse Kelly had said about dates and times. The clerk printed the documents and stamped them. The dates matched exactly what I felt inside. The day of the call was right in the middle of my most delicate hours. On my way out of the hospital, I saw Nurse Kelly in the corridor. She was carrying a tray, but when she saw me, she stopped for a second. I told her that I had taken her advice and was putting things in order. I asked if she would be willing, if needed, to write a short note about the call she had heard. She said that she would also speak with Dr. Patel, and that both of them would be ready to confirm what had happened if it was ever questioned. With my bag now heavy with papers, I made one more stop that week. I went to the courthouse and asked the clerk how to file simple supporting documents for personal use. The clerk explained that I could submit copies to create a dated record, then keep the originals. It felt strange to stand in that line, but also clean in a way. I handed over copies of my medical summary and a note about the call, along with my contact information. The clerk stamped them, and I walked out with proof that this day and these facts were now in more than my head. There was one more person I needed to see. Someone who knew Ryan, not as my son-in-law, but as a co-worker. I thought of Mark from the plant, who I had heard now worked in a senior position at Ryan's company. I still had his number. I called and asked if he had time for a coffee. He sounded pleased to hear from me and said that we could meet in the lobby of his building. The company office was larger and brighter than the plant had ever been. People in neat clothes moved quickly through the glass doors. Mark came down from one of the upper floors to meet me. He looked older, with more gray in his hair, but his smile was the same. We sat in a small meeting corner near the lobby. I told him that I had been in the hospital and that I had some concerns about how things were going in my family. I did not describe every detail, but I explained that my daughter's husband worked there and that I had noticed a change in his behavior. I said that he liked to talk about his position, his contacts, his power, and that sometimes he spoke about older people, even family, in a way that did not sit right with me. Mark listened, then said that he had seen Ryan around the office, that he was competent in some ways but very concerned about how others saw him. He said that Ryan liked to tell stories about the support he had at home, how he had a backer who always helped with money and houses. Mark had not known that this backer was me. I told Mark that there was an upcoming birthday dinner for Ryan. There would be coworkers, friends, maybe some managers present. I said that, according to what I had heard, I was still expected to be the quiet support in the background, even after the hospital. Mark shook his head slowly. He said that he did not like the sound of that and that he was glad I was looking at the situation more clearly. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun was low. I put all the papers in a single stack on the table: bank statements, medical summaries, stamped copies from the courthouse, Lewis's notes, and my old trust folder. For the first time, I saw my life not as scattered events, but as a series of entries, dates, and clear lines. I understood that I was not powerless. I had simply not used what I had. I made myself a simple dinner and sat down to eat. As I lifted the first forkful, my phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up, expecting maybe a reminder from the hospital. Instead, I saw a message from a number I recognized as belonging to Jennifer, an acquaintance who worked in the same company as Ryan and knew me from an old project. She had forwarded a screenshot. It was a group email from Ryan's office, an invitation to his grand birthday dinner at a restaurant, with a line near the end that said my daughter's father would take care of all the home preparations like always. That night, after I read Jennifer's message, I put the phone down on the table and simply sat there. The screenshot was still in my mind, even with the screen dark. A long list of work contacts, a cheerful subject line, and that one short note at the bottom that said I would handle all the home preparations like always. No question. No check-in to see if I was even out of the hospital. I stared at the stack of papers next to my plate: bank statements, medical summaries, notes from Lewis, copies with fresh stamps. For years, they had treated my effort as something automatic, like a tap that always had water. Now I was looking at the pipes instead of the faucet. I could see where everything started and where it went. I finished my dinner in silence, then moved the dishes aside and spread the documents out again. I ordered them by type and date, made small notes on sticky paper, and clipped them together. The act of sorting calmed me. It felt like working on a machine at the plant. You do not yell at a broken line. You take it apart, understand the flow, and decide where to place new stops and guards. The next morning, I went back to Lewis's office with a heavier folder. When I sat down across from him, I placed it on the table like a toolkit. I told him about the email from Ryan's work. I told him that even after intensive care, they were still telling everyone that I would take care of things as always. I said that I was done with that pattern. Lewis nodded slowly. He opened the folder and went through what I had brought: printed bank records, medical summaries, notes about the call from the hospital, and the screenshot of the invitation. He did not rush. When he finished, he leaned back and said that the facts were clear. I had been generous for years. In return, I had received not just carelessness, but open disregard. Then he opened his own file and took out the trust documents and house arrangements we had signed years earlier. He laid them side by side. He reminded me, in simple terms, what each one allowed me to do: how I could direct the trust, how I could end the right to live in the house, how I could change my will. He asked me very directly what I wanted. For a few seconds, I just listened to the faint sounds from outside the office: telephones, footsteps, a printer. Then I told him that I wanted to step back from being their support. I said I did not wish them harm, but I wanted them to feel the real weight of their choices. I wanted my name, my effort, and my resources removed from their plans. I said I would do it without shouting, but I would not take a single step backward once it began. Lewis looked at me, as if checking whether I was speaking from anger or from a deeper place. Then he nodded. He suggested we activate the parts of the trust that allowed changes when respect and contact broke down. He said we could redirect future support away from Sophie and toward purposes I chose, as long as it was written clearly. He also suggested that we prepare a formal notice ending Sophie and Ryan's right to stay in the house, giving them proper time to leave as the law required. We did not read every line out loud. That would come later. Instead, we sketched the shapes: one document to change where the trust would send its benefits, one to end their use of the house, one to state that my regular financial help and guarantees were over. Lewis said that once I signed, these would not be words in the air. They would be instructions that banks, offices, and courts would follow. He prepared drafts while I sat there, sipping water and feeling the slow, steady beat in my chest. When he came back with the papers, he did not push them at me the way Ryan once had. He placed them gently on the table and walked me through each heading. He told me that signing them would change the path of my family's future and that I should be sure. I told him I was. My voice sounded calm even in my own ears. I signed where he indicated, with careful strokes. He said he would register the changes with the proper offices and send formal notices at the right time. He also suggested that I keep my own complete set in one place, ready if anything was questioned. I told him that I already had a table waiting at home. From there, I went to the registry office. The building was quiet, with long corridors and bare walls. A clerk led me to a window where I confirmed the house records once more. The clerk printed an updated summary that showed me clearly as the owner and Sophie and Ryan as people who simply had a right to stay. With the new instruction from Lewis ready to be filed, that right would soon end. The clerk stamped some forms and told me where they would be kept. To her, it was just another property matter. To me, it was the moment when the place that had always been called their home in conversation started to return, in practice, to being mine. On my way back, I asked the taxi driver to pass by the street where the house stood. I did not get out. I simply watched from the window as we rolled slowly past. The yard was busy. There were new lights along the path, colored paper garlands hanging from a line, and a few guests already helping bring folding chairs inside. Through the open window, I saw Sophie laughing with two friends, pointing around the room and giving instructions. Near the front door, Ryan stood with a couple of his coworkers. Even from the car, I could tell they were in the middle of a story. Ryan gestured toward the side of the house and, judging by their smiles, made some comment that put him in the center and someone else below. I could guess the role he liked to assign me in those stories. The older man who could be ordered around, the dependable helper, the background figure. The taxi turned the corner, and the house slipped out of view. I did not ask to go back. I returned to my apartment, put my new documents on the table with the others, and sat for a long time in the quiet. In the following days, Lewis called to confirm that the trust changes were registered and that the notices were ready. He said that Sophie and Ryan would soon receive formal letters explaining that their right to stay in the house would end after a set period and that all future support from me would stop. I asked him not to send the letters yet. I wanted them prepared, signed, and dated, but I wanted to choose the moment when they first saw them. He understood at once. He said that as long as everything was properly signed and stamped, the timing of my delivery could be my choice, as long as we still met the legal limits. He suggested that I bring the original letters and a summary of the trust changes with me when I next met Sophie and Ryan in person. Then, after that meeting, he would send formal copies by mail and email to fix the date in the official record. I thought about where and when that meeting should happen. The answer was already on my table, the email about Ryan's birthday dinner. They wanted an evening where he could display his life, his friends, his work, his image as a man in control. They expected me to move silently behind that image, arranging food and decorations. Instead, I decided, that evening would be when I stepped out from behind the curtain and placed reality in front of him. A few days before the party, I talked to Mark again. I did not tell him every step I had taken. I simply confirmed that he would be at the dinner, since he had received the same group invitation as the others. He said he would. In his voice there was a careful interest, as if he sensed that something important might happen but did not know what. I told him that soon he would see how things really stood between me and the man who liked to talk about his backing. On the afternoon of the party, I woke early. I had not slept well, but my mind felt clear. I laid out everything on the table one last time. A simple timeline of my hospital stay, the basic summary of the call Sophie had made, the bank statement summary showing years of support, Lewis's written notices about the house and the trust, and the invitation email that proudly named me as the one who would prepare everything. I put them into a plain, firm folder, each group clipped in order. On top, I placed a small note with a list of names of people who could confirm the events. Dr. Patel, Nurse Kelly, Lewis, the bank manager, the registry clerk, and Mark. It was not a dramatic list. It was a practical one, made of people who had simply done their jobs and seen the truth while doing so. The act of placing the papers in the folder felt like packing tools into a bag before a repair job. Nothing there was illegal or hidden. Every piece was normal, almost boring, on its own. A bank printout, a stamped form, a letter. Together, they formed a clear path from who I had been in their life to who I would now become. I dressed in simple, clean clothes. Nothing flashy, nothing weak, just a good shirt, pressed trousers, and a jacket warm enough for the evening. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see the background helper they liked to show others. I saw an older man who had finally put his own system in order. As the sun began to go down, I picked up the folder and my keys and left the apartment. The air outside was cool. I walked slowly to the street corner and called a taxi. When the car arrived, I gave the restaurant's name and sat back, holding the folder on my knees. On the way, we passed bright windows and busy sidewalks. I imagined the restaurant's private hall already filled with voices, glasses, and plates. I pictured Sophie at the center, checking the arrangement, and Ryan practicing a speech about his success. In all of their planning, I knew I was either invisible or placed in a small role, the dependable older man who took care of tasks and then stepped aside. The taxi pulled into the crowded parking lot outside the restaurant. Cars were everywhere, some already parked, others looking for spaces. People in nice clothes walked toward the entrance. I paid the driver, stepped out carefully, and stood for a moment beside the car, feeling the weight of the folder under my arm. From inside the building, I could hear the faint sound of music and laughter. For a brief second, an old habit stirred in me, the urge to turn away, to leave them to their evening and avoid conflict. Then I remembered Sophie's voice in intensive care, telling me not to dare come back if I did not serve their plans. I also remembered Dr. Patel's calm warning that going back to the same pattern could put me right on his table again. I closed the car door behind me with a soft click. I adjusted my grip on the folder until it felt balanced in my hand. Then I walked toward the entrance, step by slow step. As I came near, the main door opened for another group of guests, and I saw a glimpse of light and movement from inside. A toast was starting, someone was lifting a glass, and voices were rising. I reached out and touched the cool metal of the handle, feeling the vibration of sound from the other side, and then I began to pull the door open. The door swung open under my hand, and warm light spilled over me. The sound inside was louder than I expected, clinking glasses, laughter, music from a speaker in the corner. For a moment, I stood at the edge of the private hall, letting my eyes adjust. The room was full. There were long tables set with white cloths and small candles. A banner with Ryan's name hung on the far wall. At the center of the room stood Ryan himself, holding a glass, one arm lifted as if he was in the middle of a story. Sophie stood beside him in a bright dress, smiling in that wide, practiced way she had learned for photos. Guests turned when the door shut behind me. Some faces looked curious, some confused. A few of Ryan's coworkers looked at me with vague recognition, trying to place the older man at the entrance. Near the front, I saw Mark seated with a small group from the company. His eyes widened a bit when he saw me. Sophie saw me next. For a second, her smile froze. I could see the quick flicker of surprise in her eyes. Then she smoothed it away and gave me the same polite expression she used when dealing with a waiter. She took a step toward me, as if to guide me quietly to a corner. Ryan lowered his glass, looked toward the door, and laughed in a loud, easy way. He told the room that the party could really begin now that the man who always saved the day had arrived. He spoke as if everything was normal, as if I had come straight from their kitchen with trays and tools in my hands. I did not move from the entrance. I shifted the folder under my arm and walked slowly down the side of the room instead of toward Sophie's outstretched hand. I greeted a few people I recognized from earlier visits to the house, then stopped near the front where everyone could see me. I nodded to Mark. He gave the smallest nod back, eyes alert. The music faded as someone turned the volume down. Conversations thinned. Ryan tried to pick up his speech again, talking about how grateful he was for the people in his life, for his team at work, for his supportive family. He threw in a line about how his father-in-law was always there when needed. I raised my hand a little. My voice was not loud, but the room had gone quiet enough that people could hear me. I said I would like, with their permission, to say something before the evening went on. There was an awkward pause. Sophie stepped closer and whispered that we could talk later in another room. I answered that what I had to say concerned everyone who had been told I was part of this evening. Ryan tried to make a joke, saying that I must be planning a surprise. I looked at him for a moment and then said that, in a way, he was right. I set the folder on the edge of an empty side table and opened it. My hands did not shake. I had handled more dangerous machinery than paper. I took out the first item, a simple printed page with dates and times. I told the room that 1 week before this party, I had not been in my apartment or in my daughter's kitchen. I had been lying in intensive care after a serious heart incident. I explained in clear, plain words that while I was there, with wires on my chest and doctors beside me, my daughter had called. I said that instead of asking about my condition, she had told me about this very party, about the preparations, about the work that needed to be done. I told them she had insisted I come help, and that when I said I could not, she had warned me not to come home again. I did not repeat every phrase she had used. It was not needed. I told them that both my doctor and the nurse had been in the room and had heard the call on speaker. I lifted the page with the hospital dates and said that these were the records from those days, already filed with the proper office. I did not wave it in the air. I just let it rest in my hand long enough for people to see the stamps. The room was very still. Some guests shifted in their seats, looking at Sophie. Her face had lost its easy smile. She said quickly that there had been a misunderstanding, that she had been under pressure, that I was making it sound worse than it was. A few people near her stared down at their plates. I placed the hospital summary back in the folder and took out the next set, a short list of figures. I told the room that for many years I had supported Sophie and Ryan in quiet ways. I had helped with the wedding, the house, repairs, periods without income. I had paid many of the costs that made their life in that house possible. I said this not to gain sympathy, but to make clear that I had not been a burden in the story some had heard. Ryan started to say that this was private, that money was a family matter, that I did not need to talk about it here. I replied that it had become less private when he sent an email to his company saying that I would handle all the home preparations, as always, even after intensive care. I held up a printed copy of that email. Mark leaned forward a little, reading the line with my name. Then I took out the legal notices. My voice stayed even. I said that when my wife had passed, I had set up a family trust and property arrangements with the help of my lawyer, Lewis. I had given Sophie and Ryan the right to live in my old house under certain conditions, believing that respect and care would flow both ways. I explained briefly that these documents had clauses for what would happen if that respect ended. I told them that, after careful review, I had decided to activate those clauses. I said that as of now, the trust no longer directed its support to Sophie and Ryan. The benefits that had been meant for them would go instead to other purposes I had chosen. I did not name them. That was not needed here. I simply stated that my daughter was no longer the main future recipient of what I had built. Next, I held up the notice regarding the house. I said that this letter, already signed and ready to be filed formally, ended Sophie and Ryan's right to live in the property after the legally required period. I added that they would receive their own copies by mail and email, so there would be no confusion. The house they had called theirs was, and always had been, mine. Soon, as the notice took effect, their time in it would close. A murmur went through the room. Some guests glanced at each other, unsure whether to look at the birthday cake or at the paper in my hand. Sophie's face had gone pale. She said that I could not be serious, that a father did not do this to a child. I looked at her and said that a child did not threaten a parent in intensive care and expect nothing to change. Finally, I turned slightly toward Mark and the small group from the company. I said that there was one more matter. Years before, I had invested a modest but steady amount in one of the partner projects linked with their company on the recommendation of people I trusted. I had never spoken about it much. I told them that earlier that week, after hearing how Ryan described his backing and older supporters, I had given instructions to move that investment elsewhere. I did not describe the size in exact numbers. I simply said that for a man in Ryan's position, at his level, losing that piece of support and having his conduct toward older clients and family known to his seniors would have its own effect. I glanced briefly at Mark. He met my eyes and said, in a level tone, that he and Ryan would have a serious talk at the office. Ryan began to speak quickly, claiming that I was confused, that I was using my age and health to make him look bad, that I did not understand how the modern world worked. His words tumbled over each other. The smooth control he had at the start of the evening was gone. Sophie tried to step in, saying that we should resolve this as a family and that I was choosing the worst possible moment. I closed the folder and placed it on the side table. I told them, and everyone watching, that there was nothing to resolve in private anymore. I was not asking them for anything. I was not threatening them with anything outside the law. I was simply informing them, in the presence of their friends, co-workers, and contacts, of changes that had already begun. I said I wished Ryan a calm birthday, and that I hoped, one day, they would understand how many chances they had received before this night. Then I stepped back from the table. No one moved to stop me. Some guests stared at their glasses. Others looked at me with a mix of surprise and quiet respect. One older woman, near the end of the table, gave me a small nod, as if to say she understood. I walked toward the exit at the far end of the hall. As I passed Mark's table, he lightly touched my arm and said that he would be in touch soon, regarding both business and what he had learned about his employee. There was no anger in his voice, just a firm, professional weight. I did not look back at Sophie and Ryan. Their voices rose behind me, low and urgent, as they bent over the folder and the stamped pages inside it. Chairs creaked, whispers spread, glasses were set down without a toast. The hall door closed behind me with a soft click. The sounds from inside turned to a distant blur. In the parking lot, the air was cooler than before. I walked slowly across the asphalt, feeling each step, the night quiet around me. At the edge of the lot, I paused for a moment and took one breath in and one breath out. Then I kept walking, leaving the light and noise of the restaurant behind.